Okay, can you hear me? Good. Um, yeah, so this is an interesting topic that I thought maybe the guild would be interested in. It may be a little bit of a controversial topic. Hopefully it'll generate some thought or some debate. But it honestly, like I think most of us are on this spectrum somewhere of like what I'm going to talk about. So um, there's this neat quote from Charles Darwin that appeared in Origin, saying that thus I believe that most wonderful of all known instincts, that of the hive bee can be explained by natural selection. The individual swarm, which thus made the best cells with least labor and least waste of honey in the secretion of wax, having succeeded best, and having transmitted their newly acquired economical instincts to new swarms, which in their turn will have had the best chance of exceeding in the struggle for existence. And so we're all, as beekeepers, somewhat familiar with Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution and natural selection. Um, and so we can apply these concepts to beekeeping, right? Um, on their own, before we started keeping bees, maybe 10,000 years ago, honeybees experienced millions of years of living in the environment on their own. And their behaviors have been determined by natural selection, like which behaviors allow them to succeed the best in their particular environments. Um, natural selection maximizes the abilities of different systems to transfer those beneficial genes to their offspring. Then those genes get expressed, and those behaviors of those animals, outcompete or outsurvive their conspecifics, and then they pass those genes on, et cetera. And so the colonies that have the highest success typically are the ones that are best adapted to their environment, right? If they're not adapted to their environment, they're going to die off. If they're not cold tolerant, or if they're not heat tolerant, or if they can't deal with a certain type of forage that's not best for them, they would die off. And this process of adaptation by natural selection has produced 27 known subspecies of Apis mellifera across the world. And so if we keep this in mind as we keep our bees and take care of our own bees, um, we can help our bees to be the best bees that we can raise. So this isn't my idea. I didn't create this idea. It first was sort of introduced back in 2016 in the academic literature, and then Tom Seeley, who probably a lot of you have heard of, he wrote The Honeybee Democracy, and more recently The Lives of Bees, sort of began to popularize the concept in his books, and he's sort of gone out on the lecture circuit and talked about it and published in the lay press. Um, and so I followed his article and just recently published a paper in the American Bee Journal talking about a stewardship model of Darwinian beekeeping that I'll talk about in the last half of the slides today. But before I start, I wonder if anyone's heard of like Darwinian beekeeping or read anything or seen any of like Tom Seeley's videos or anything like that? No. Okay, good. Well, Peter has. Well, that's good. Hopefully this is boring. If this is boring to you, that means you already know everything, and that's what we want. Okay, not boring yet. So I just have a couple slides where I want to compare wild colonies versus managed colonies. And again, I know there's a spectrum and matching frames, making nukes, shipping things out to the almonds, treating with every known chemical we can to maximize honey production, taking all the honey. Like I know all of us in this room aren't that type of beekeeper, but some of us are on that spectrum, right? Like some people may take their bees to the almonds, others might be no treatment beekeepers or no treatment adjacent beekeepers or thinking about not treating. And so, but all of us in all of those different approaches, we're like farmers, right? We modify the environments in which our livestock, the bees, live to benefit us, right? So we want to keep our bees alive. We want a couple of honey supers to be taken off every year so we can have some honey. We want them not to swarm. We want the best queen, like all these things. So we are manipulating the environment of our bees, even though we're not like on this extreme here. But at the same time, we're not just like leaving them alone as if they would be in the forest either, like on their own, being subject to selective pressures in their environments and maybe dying, right? And so the point of this whole Darwinian beekeeping idea is that changing the living conditions of agricultural animals often aren't the best thing for animals. And it's not going to help them to overcome or develop resistance to pests, um, adapt to like local forage conditions, that sort of thing. And so love him or hate him, Randy Oliver always shows the slide of a puppy that's covered in mites, you know, and he always says, "How could you not treat this puppy for mites if this was your pet? And if so, how could you not treat your bees for mites?" Right? Um, I thought it'd be interesting to show this slide here, which shows that, like with our bees, there can be a whole spectrum of approaches in terms of like management of agriculture. So if you've ever driven on Highway 5 to go south to LA or whatever, you'll pass through Coalinga, California. And before you see it, you'll smell it. It's horrible. It's this massive feedlot on the side of the freeway. And this is what it looks like. You can see this from the freeway. It's the most horrible, gross thing ever. And this is the Harris Ranch. And I went online last night to figure out where Harris provides their beef. And sure enough, it goes to In-N-Out, goes to Costco. Pretty gross stuff. In contrast, if you drive from Pacifica down to Half Moon Bay, you'll pass by the Markegard family grass-fed cattle operation. And you'll see signs on the side of the road, and you'll see like a gate and everything. And these guys send all their beef to like farmers markets, and to different farmers markets. And their cows are just free ranging. Oh, they're not totally free ranging. They're penned in some way, but they're out roaming the hills, you know, and eating green grass. And it's a different approach. And so in this context, I want to just go through 10 differences between wild colonies and managed colonies. And again, some of these things may not apply to all of us. Some of them may be more specific to commercial beekeepers or migratory beekeepers, but some of us do sort of implement these practices with our bees in our backyards. So the first thing is like, where are your bees coming from? Are they coming from Grass Valley, where Randy Oliver breeds his queens? Are they coming from Chico? Are they coming from the almond pollination? And who knows where those bees came from? You can buy queens from Hawaii and have them sent over, you know, in a tube in the mail. You can buy bees from Man Lake. The thing is, though, those bees that we're importing, even if they're from Chico or you know, from Randy Oliver, that can deal with coastal temperatures in our winters and our forage and the issues that they might experience here in the Bay Area directly. And so you know, Hawaiian bees sound cool, but Hawaii is not San Mateo, right, or Redwood City. Um, and so all of the things, all of the statements that I'm going to make here, I have scientific references in case people want to follow up or challenge what I'm saying. But there have been studies that show that colonies with queens of local origin lived longer than colonies with queens of non-local origin. And so for me, I would prefer to get my queens from you know, somewhere around here. I have a list of people, maybe slide 20, or mostly I get my bees from swarms. So like survivor bees that have overwintered. Again, I don't know where those queens and those bees have come from, but at least they're sort of somewhat adapted to like our local environment. Colony density and distribution, again, like, out in the forest, you might have a bee tree here separated by a quarter mile, then there's another bee tree. But in our yards, and I can say like on the side of my house, at one point I had 13 hives in the area between, me and like where those snacks are, just stacked up like 3 hives on top of each other. And it looked almost like like a container ship, with all the, what are those things, like containers that go on semi trucks, right? Just stacked up. Like that's how I had my bees. And it was amazing that they could even remember like which hole to go into, right? Um, and so we all sort of know this. This is intuitive that crowded colonies experience greater competition for forage, risk of being robbed by neighboring colonies, problems reproducing. So like if queens go out to be mated, maybe the queen doesn't come back to the right hive and experiences maybe not so nice welcome into another hive. Increased pathogen and parasite transmission between colonies horizontally. And not only does that hurt the bees, but it keeps alive the most virulent strains of pathogens at the same time. Difference number 3, when we're comparing wild colonies to managed colonies, is the size of nest cavities. So if anyone's done, got a call during the windy season here, I guess like in the winter, the rainy season, or got a call from like a tree removal person about like, oh, there's an oak tree fallen down and there's bees flying around everywhere. You're a beekeeper. Would you be interested in these bees? If you've ever gone out and checked out those colonies, they're quite small. Like the inside of an oak tree is maybe a foot in diameter, a foot and a half, and maybe there's this much room, which is significantly smaller than 2 or 3 deeps with 2 to 4 supers stacked up on top of it worth of bees. And so, large hives managed for honey production are less likely to reproduce by swarming. So there's less scope for the selection of healthy colonies. And the more brood you have, obviously, the more chance you have of having explosions in populations of mites and other diseases that may reproduce in the brood. So this is a paper that was published in 2016 comparing small hives, that's the green lines, and large hives, quantifying the number of adult bees over 2 years, number of cells of brood over those same 2 years, and the number of mites per 100 bees. And in all these cases, smaller hives had, of course, fewer adult bees, fewer brood cells, but also, except for that one funny time point, fewer mites per 100 bees. And in this paper, in the discussion section, they one of the larger colonies was starting to die off, and the smaller colony went in to rob that hive out and just picked up tons of mites and brought the mites back into their hive after that.
That's not typical.
This one data point wouldn't be typical, but I think in general, they're saying that smaller hives are going to have fewer problems with disease, and they'll be more likely to swarm, which is good if you want to encourage the expansion of like healthy hives. Like a weak hive that's full of mites that you're allowing tons of space and preventing from swarming, those might not be the bees that you want to swarm anyway. Yeah.
So in that data, were those basically very identically constructed hives, and some were constructed in small spaces and some were constructed in, just wondering how many variables got changed between the 2 sets of data?
That's a
Because
good
you're going to
question.
compare trees versus our standard Langstroth boxes, like there's a zillion things that are different.
Right. I think they controlled for as many of these variables as
Got
they
it.
could by using like standard boxes, 2 deeps, 1 deep versus 3 deeps, and stacking things up. None of these bees were treated. They all had access to the same forage, same temperature, same like location, all that stuff. That's a good question. Like, how many of these variables did they control for? Yeah, it was published in PLOS One, which is a very legitimate journal. And I believe the whole journal is open access, so you could certainly go and read that paper if you want. So difference number 4 is the propolis envelope. So within a tree colony, if you've ever seen one or cut one open with a chainsaw or been called out, you know, there's one laying in the street, cracked open. The bees build the colony inside the tree, but they also make a whole layer of propolis that surrounds that comb, the propolis envelope, it's called. And so this thing is thought to serve many purposes, including waterproofing, preventing fungal decay, reducing cracks and entrances, and also reducing microbial loads. So of all of the components that we harvest from the hive and consume or sell or make use of, right? So wax, honey, pollen, propolis, venom even. The propolis possesses the strongest antimicrobial properties of all of the hive components. And there's a study published in 2015 showing that without a propolis envelope, kind of like, you know, what we have in our beehives, in our Langstroth boxes in our backyards or whatever, where we scrape all the propolis off, those bees have to invest more in costly immune system activity. So synthesis of antimicrobial peptides, activation of you know, other sorts of components of their immune systems. 5, same picture. This came from the paper that I wrote. So in addition to the propolis envelope, in all tree colonies and colonies, if you've ever opened up like a wall or something and there's a big established colony, there'll be all this junk and debris in the bottom of the colony, right? So normally bees are very fastidious and clean, and if there's a bee who's dying, you know, because of old age or it's injured or sick, they'll carry that bee out, fly it off, and like drop it somewhere. They don't want that in the hive. But they allow all this junk to accumulate at the base of like a tree cavity. And even when Langstroth, if you go back and look at his original schematics, he allowed for a debris collection area underneath the frames. That's why our frames don't just touch the bottom of the hive. Also to allow a space for like the foragers to come in. Sometimes they're not allowed fully into the nest, but he did allow for some space, right? And so there's a quote that I really liked, this guy Cole from this paper. He described it as such, like, through the drop of organic matter like wax, pollen, or dead bees, honeybee nests indirectly nourish a whole cosmos of organisms that live from detritus inside tree cavities. And that detritus hosts numerous microbial communities. That makes sense, right? Because it's a bunch of like dead bees and fermenting honey and propolis and wax and dead things, and it's moist and it's warm, right? So a lot of stuff is going to grow in there. And that includes bacteria, yeast, probably some viruses that contribute to honey processing, the gut microbiota of these bees in the colony, and also protection against pathogens. Number 6, this is going to be the most controversial slide of all of them, right? Of all the 10 things that I'm going to show you here. So we all know what wax moth damage looks like, and we've all seen these horrible moths flying around our garage. They even get inside my house. And we've all seen these nasty, like, you know, wax moth larvae like in the hives, like tunneling through the wax. And you open up your hive and you're like, ah, geez, you know, like you decide to scrape it out or, you know, do whatever with it. And yeah, we don't like them because they damage comb. But the fact is that bees and wax moths have sort of evolved together in a way, right? The technical term would be symbiotic mutualism, because they have a symbiotic relationship. They share things mutually with each other. And this sounds really weird, right? Because we think of them as enemies, as pests, and we have to squish them, we have to kill them. They're going to destroy our comb. Right, so larvae can compromise the integrity of wax combs by making those tunnels through your frames. We employ like tons of chemical treatments to kill these wax moths, control their populations. But so the moths are deriving food resources from the bees. They're tunneling through, they're eating pollen, they're consuming wax, which benefits the wax moths. But at the same time, the bees are benefiting from the wax moths coming in and preferentially or selectively consuming the oldest, grossest brood nest part of the frames. The oldest, yuckiest part of the brood nest is filled with larval exudate. So these are like the shells around the pupa that makes the cells smaller. These cells have fecal material from developing larvae. This old wax contains tons of like agrochemicals if your bees are out in the Central Valley, accumulated pesticides from our treatments. Heavy metals have been shown to accumulate in this old dark comb. And interestingly, the accidental introduction of wax moths into New Zealand correlated with the reduced prevalence of American foulbrood, because these wax moths go in there and they consume all that old, infected, gross comb. And so it's been shown also that new comb generation following wax moth processing due to its larger cell size, because now these cells are fresh wax and there's no like larval exuvia or feces and toxins and disease-causing agents, is associated with greater brood production and a higher weight of individual young bees. I think we had somebody online, maybe? Oh, okay. So this is, you open up your hive box and you see these frames that are full of like frass and like tunnels, and you're like, oh no, like I'm gonna have to throw this frame away. But if you give these bees, if you leave these frames with the bees, and I'm sure some of the beekeepers in the room or on the call will confirm this, the bees clean this stuff up. And so then you're left with kind of like what you'd see, like in old-timey cartoons or whatever, where the moths come in, they eat the clothes in the closet, and that's why you have to use mothballs, and so you have these holes in the clothing. And so the wax kind of, the foundation looks sort of like that, right, with these holes. And the bees will go in and repair that. And that's maybe like, a 30% reduction in yucky old comb, thanks to the wax moths. Now, I'll come back to this later, because obviously you don't want to let the wax moths just run wild in your hives, right? And just consume all your frames and make a giant mess, leading to you having to just throw those frames away. Obviously, we don't want that. But I'm saying just consider the role of these wax moths. Okay, so the seventh difference is the presence of drone comb. We all on site cut out as much drone comb as possible, right? Because we believe that that's where the mites are reproducing. There's some ratio of like, more mites produced in drone comb than regular brood comb or something. This is a picture that I grabbed online showing a colony from the inside of, I think it's a pepper tree, and you can see these big sheets of drone comb here on the left compared to like normal smaller cell brood comb here. And that probably represents about 10 to 25% of the total comb is brood comb, actually. And so Tom Seeler would say that inhibiting colonies from rearing drones boosts their honey production. Yeah, of course, we know this. And slows reproduction by varroa. Yeah, we know that also. But that it prevents the healthiest colonies from passing on their genes, because if there's no drones, they can't propagate the colony, right? The drones can't go out and mate and spread the good genes around. And cutting away your drone comb from really strong, healthy colonies that maybe you haven't had to treat in years doesn't allow them to go out and like, spread the good genes around either. And these are the colonies that are the most able to, or are the strongest colonies, they have the extra resources to build drone comb, kind of like, how male peacocks or male birds have that extra energy to develop like colorful, beautiful plumage, to show that they have this extra energy because they're healthier animals. They're not covered in mites or whatever that they have to deal with. So 8 is stable nest organization. So in nature, inside of a tree, an oak tree or wherever, the bees organize their nests in a, the configuration that we're all familiar with, right? Like a brood nest and a band of pollen and honey, sort of nectar and honey stored on the periphery and or above the nest. And that's what the bees want. They've evolved that 3D structure for a reason over the years, right? Over the millennia. But we do these funny things like checkerboarding your bees to stop swarming, and you can go on YouTube and see a bunch of really crazy looking guys. Like, I don't know if I'd be taking my beekeeping advice from this character here, but maybe what he's saying is okay. I don't know. And then, there's cool diagrams of like, okay, now here's how you do it. And you spread these two out and you drop in some empty frames. And sometimes they recommend disrupting a brood nest. Sometimes it's just about like you're checkerboarding your honey supers, which may be okay. But people go in there and they mess these things up or mess around with these things. And nest, or to encourage honey storage. And this disrupts all sorts of aspects of colony functioning, such as egg laying for the queen, right? So if the queen has this nice brood nest, and then suddenly you're dropping in 2 empty frames, the queen doesn't know, like, should she go over here and lay, and then move around that new frame and go back and lay over here, and then move around the other empty frame and lay over here, or stop laying altogether. That's confusing. They don't know where to store their pollen around the brood nest. The bees want to be on the comb, so how do they decide which comb to be on at night? And so thermoregulation could be altered by these funky techniques. 9, we're almost there. So diverse versus homogeneous food sources. So all of our bees in our backyards are going out and foraging, many miles, and they're going to this source of nectar and this source of pollen, and next week it changes, and that's what our bees want, right? They want natural pollen. They want a variety of food sources, just like us, right? Like, you could eat Ritz crackers all day and macaroni and cheese and wine, but that's maybe not the best for you. So, managed colonies are often placed in agricultural ecosystems like massive almond orchards, and they have access to like a monofloral crop of nectar and pollen. Sometimes they're fed pollen patties. Sometimes people will drop like massive containers of high fructose corn syrup for them, especially if they're interested in honey production. It's super easy for the bees to just go into these like 50-gallon drums and take out high fructose corn syrup and bring it into the hive and dehydrate it, and that can be considered honey at the grocery store. So, research has shown that a variety of pollen sources is important. Nurse bees given diets with polyfloral pollen lived longer than those fed monofloral pollens. And even though pollen substitutes can stimulate brood rearing, they may result in poorer quality workers. And then, of course, while high fructose corn syrup provides a convenient and readily available source of sugar or source of material to make honey out of, it lacks complex nutrients, antioxidants, enzymes, things that you would find in natural, like nectar, that they bring into the hive. And so the lack of a healthy diet leads to like health issues from bees, just as if I drank soda all day long, right? And ate brownies or whatever, which I would like to do, but it's not the best for me. Oh, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, this is right on time. So the last one here is disease treatments. And again, this is controversial, right? And we all have different opinions around, do we treat? Do we not treat? Do we kill mites? Do we not kill mites? if we're following these principles of Darwinian beekeeping, we have to think about this, right? So when we treat colonies for diseases, we're interfering with the host parasite arms race by killing off the parasite, or trying to eliminate viruses or whatever. And we're just allowing the bees to not develop strong defenses or ways to overcome the effects of these parasites or pathogens. Most managed colonies in North America and Europe possess little resistance to varroa mites. But there are wild populations, and I'll show you a slide about this later, that have existed pre-varroa mite and post-varroa mite and still have the same average number of colonies year over year, which is interesting. And so also something to consider is that any selective pressure that you apply, so if you're treating or you have some mite control, or the strongest versions of the various viruses that we have in our hives. So you can think of this as like, every fall, all of us rush out and I rush out and get a COVID vaccination and I get a flu shot, because the strains now that are circulating are the ones that were able to evade the vaccine last time around. So now we need to respond to like the current viruses. And of course, like the viruses will mutate and become infectious again. And then next year rolls around and we need to get vaccinated again. So it's the same sort of thing, right? Like with these mites, like you apply a treatment, you might kill some mites, but there's going to be some strong mites remaining. And this is typically why if you're given an antibiotic, the doctor will say, yeah, you might feel better in 2 days or 3 days, but you really do need to take the 2-week course, take the full 3-week course of your antibiotic. Make sure that you kill all of the bacteria. There may be some that are developing a resistance, and you don't want those things to get out of control. Okay, so finally, so those are the differences between like natural and managed hives. What's this Darwinian beekeeping thing? Really, the whole message, the whole point of Darwinian beekeeping is to put managed colonies as much as possible back into the honeybee's original environment. And again, that's going to be a spectrum, right? Like you could have your beehives in your backyard or the side of your house, and like all you do all year is take the honey supers off. You don't do any interventions. You don't move frames around. You don't treat for anything. That's a quite natural environment for those bees. Or you could be in there like I would do for my first couple of years of beekeeping. Every week I'm doing inspections. I'm getting on the internet. I want to be an interventionist. I want to try things. I want to, let me see how checkerboarding works in this box. Let me split this one. Let me try a new queen over here. You kind of want to play around and experiment with your bees. And so with Darwinian beekeeping, again, the goal is to just try to let the bees be bees and let them learn how to be strong and respond to things in their environment, right? So it's not for large scale beekeepers. It's not for like guys who have 100 hives and they're trying to sell those off as nukes, or take 500 hives into the almonds, or generate hundreds of gallons of honey to sell for whatever. This approach isn't going to work for them, and it's probably not going to work for people who have bees on their roof in like San Francisco either, right? But for us, we're kind of small scale sideliners. Most of us, we're somewhat rural. Probably most of us want to avoid chemical treatments to some degree, right? And most of us are probably satisfied with a modest honey crop. Like last year I got 15 gallons of honey, and that's way more honey than I'm going to give out at Christmas or to the kids' teachers or to the coaches or to people at work or my family and consume like in our own household. So for me, it's an interesting concept, like this Darwinian beekeeping. It could work for me. So I developed what I called the stewardship model, right? And so we, like beekeepers, modify the environments in which our livestock live by putting them in these boxes, by scraping propolis, by killing mites, by squishing wax moths, by manipulating frames, by doing all these funky things. But they may make the bees more prone or more susceptible to problems, to issues. And so yeah, we know it's detrimental to be overrun by pests and disease, but the inverse may also be true. I think of like when I was a kid growing up, my mom in our kitchen would spray bleach spray everywhere. It'd be like hand sanitizer. Oh, you came in from outside, wash your hands. Um, everything was like immaculate, like in our house. And I have allergies and I always get sick now because whatever. My wife grew up on a sort of like a she's got the toughest immune system like of all of us. Whereas I have like this delicate like immune system because I lived in a sterile environment growing up. And so does my sister. And so you could think about the effects of an over enthusiastic implementation of integrated pest management practices. You can go crazy with this stuff, but maybe you don't want to, right? But it really depends on what you want and how you want to manage your colonies. I'm not saying this is the best way. I'm saying here's the information and maybe you find it valuable for your purposes, for your goals with your bees. And so just to compare the two, just looking at the time, with stewardship, we're taking more of a custodial role, like a caretaking role versus like an interventionist approach and trying to control everything. Okay. In a stewardship model, we're trying to consider like ecological dynamics, like the superorganism. What about all that detritus? And what about the propolis? And these things are there for a reason. The bees have allowed this stuff to form or encourage its formation for some benefit for those bees versus like, I don't care about any of that stuff. All I want is honey so I can pay for all my tractors and trucks and pumps and go to the grocery store or whatever. Stewardship, we're trying to work more with the intrinsic tendency of the bees versus artificial manipulations, selective breeding, chemical treatments, forcing the bees to do what we want them to do. We're trying to consider the superorganism. If you're like a hardcore, like commercial beekeeper, you don't care about that stuff. All you care about is keeping your bees alive. And so with a stewardship model, maybe you're more concerned about resilience and allowing your bees to adapt and having a strong like local survivor stock versus just, again, production of a resource, either honey or more bees so they can sell the bees to bee clubs or, whatever your operation has you thinking about. And so I think I have 8 suggestions for people who are interested in implementing maybe some of these concepts. The first is to try to keep local bees. Work with bees that are best adapted to your local environment. And you can get hyper local, right? Like bees that live on somebody's roof, like Charlie Blevins in San Francisco, may not be the bees for Redwood City, where it's hotter and drier and there's different forage. I wouldn't buy bees from a Hawaiian breeder or as cool as much as I love Hawaii and as kind of cool as it would be to have Hawaiian bees, right? I just wouldn't do it. So I'm like a big proponent of catching swarms and like working with swarms. Yeah, they're a little more scrappy and kind of, you know, different than bees that have been bred to be docile and produce tons of honey and look cool. But those are the bees I like. Yeah, sorry, Laura.
Just 1 second so you can be on the mic.
How do you know all those swarm bees aren't just from your neighbor's hives?
Well, they probably are. They probably are. Of course they are. But or they're my own hives. But it could be that they came from, I mean, the likelihood is that they came from somebody else's hive, but maybe that's not the first year queen. Maybe they've requeened. And so that queen has been, the coefficient of relatedness of the offspring is like 0.75. They're not exactly all twins. And that's why they look different and their stripes and the colors and all that stuff. So maybe if they're like generation 2, they are more local and wild, and the drones that they're mating with could be, you know, interestingly, Conrad, if you guys know Conrad, he's got an apiary sort of halfway between Woodside and Skylonda, like Skyline Boulevard, halfway up, kind of isolated, and he believes that he mating boxes or whatever. And we should ask him to have a field trip and have everybody up there, and he can just show us his operation. It's super cool. But he kind of thinks that he's got an isolated drone population up there in the hills. So he makes drones, he makes queens, and he feels that they're kind of like isolated. So he's got his own like population that he's developed up there, which I think is really neat. Anyway, you know, you can buy, yeah.
I've purchased bees, queens from Conrad, but in listening to you, that location is very different from where I live.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
Someone who raised queens closer to where I am, that queen would be better adapted to where I am.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah. So, you know, you could get queens from Elizabeth, she's in Palo Alto. You could get queens from Ray, he's out in Pacifica, kind of Montera. You get queens from Aiden, he's out on the coast also. Ala's got, I don't know where her queens are. Kendall, I think she's got bees down like in the South Bay. And on top of the library in Redwood City. Yeah. So, you know, you could get, how local do you want, right? If I catch a swarm in Belmont, I consider that local, even though I live in Redwood City. But I wouldn't try to catch a swarm off a Skyline, to your point, and be like, oh, these guys will do great in Redwood City where it's hot and dry and the forage is different. Tim, yeah.
So I've been a proponent of catching feral bees. I've never bought bees.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like 10 years or so. My bees are only swarms, and they're
Yeah.
actually, with 3 exceptions, are swarms that have come to my backyard. So I'm going to posit that if you can't catch a swarm, you can't maintain a hive in your neighborhood. Because if there are swarms, if bees can live in your neighborhood, then I would say you should be able to catch a swarm in your neighborhood.
And if you can't catch a swarm, that means your neighborhood isn't suitable because no
Means
bees will
bees don't
overwinter and
survive in your
create
neighborhood.
swarms. Are there
I'm
any?
just wondering.
are-
I'm just wondering.
Could be. Are there any neighborhoods where we've never seen a swarm?
That'd be the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one time I made a map of, I pulled all the IP addresses from everyone who hit the San Mateo Bee Guild swarm page, like, hey, I need someone to collect my swarm, and then mapped them to like certain neighborhoods all over the Bay Area. And that actually was, I sent that to American Bee Journal and they published it. You can get anything published in the American Bee Journal, apparently. You know, you look at Randy Oliver, like, part 16 of Randy's musings on mites or whatever.
Yeah. But I would also like
Yeah.
to say I live in a neighborhood with a lot of the big valley oaks,
Yeah.
and a lot of those have natural swarms. So I wouldn't say if you get swarms that they're necessarily thrown off
That's true.
beekeepers' hives.
That's true.
They could be local.
Yeah. But I've caught
Native.
swarms and then put them in my hive box, and then a couple days later went to see if there's a queen, and cool, she's marked already. Where'd you get that pink mark, you know? I don't broadcast that to the email list because someone would say, that's my queen, I want those bees back. Okay, so that's the first thing. Try to get local bees if you can. Second thing is, yeah, we live in the Bay Area. We're not in the North Bay. We're not somewhere where we have big giant yards or farms or whatever. So this may not really work out for us. But, you know, like I said, I had, 20 hives stacked up in like this tall and this wide of an area at some point. So I don't have room to do this. But if you can, space them out a little bit. It'll prevent bees foragers coming and just joining the strongest colony that they can find, or your queen going off and on her mating flight and coming back to the wrong hive, and you've got a queenless hive and a dead queen bee somewhere, that sort of thing. It's thought that bees for varroa mites to reproduce. There's more of a chance for your bees to swarm if you're okay with swarming. Peter, I know, is like just fine with bees swarming. I'm fine with my bees swarming. I feel like it's natural. And, if you're a teenager and it's, you're trying to suppress your teenage urges, same thing with our bees, right? Like, bees want to be bees, so let bees be bees and do their thing, right? So you might consider just one deep hive body for a brood nest and maybe 1 to 2 supers for honey. You won't harvest as much honey, of course, but you might have healthier bees. Yeah, your colonies are going to swarm, but swarming is natural. Again, like that's how they replace queens. That's how they have a break in the brood cycle, and that's a natural way to stop like mite populations, right? If you're interrupting the brood cycle for a month or whatever. And so this was just a study that looked at the number of the average like nest volume in a forested area, and typically it was about 40 liters of volume, and so that's about 1 deep 10-frame hive body. 2 deeps is about 80, etc. But you can go to Man Lake and buy the best and most complete wooden kit, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes there that you could fill up with bees if you wanted to. So 4, there's 8 of these things. You can encourage or allow propolis formation in your hives. I can't say that I don't, midsummer when I'm pulling boxes off, I can't say that it drives me crazy that I have to like jam my hive tool in there and crack these things and watch like the sticky propolis like release the boxes from on top of each other. I scrape those things. It's just too much for me to deal with. But you may consider, sorry, I should clarify. I scrape the propolis from around like the edges of the boxes. But if I see propolis on the inside of my boxes, I leave it. I'm not sure that's making a big deal or it's contributing a lot, but I'd leave it.
I don't mind with the hard prying. That's kind of fun.
No,
What I
fun.
really don't like is when the frames are glued together with propolis.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
when I finally get them out, I try to scrape that little edge that sticks together because it drives me crazy.
Right. I'll scrape all that stuff off too. I'll scrape all that stuff too, like off of the frames and the rabbit, the ears and all that stuff, because yeah, I don't want bees just to have bees in my yard. I want honey, and I need to take frames out and replace frames. So I scrape the frames and I scrape the edges of the boxes as well. But you could consider buying boxes that are pre-roughed or built out of rough sawn lumber, and the bees won't like these grooves, and they'll kind of make a propolis coating on the inside of these boxes. Or you can use a twist knot wire brush. I had to look that up. I like to think that I'm manly and I know about tools and stuff, but I didn't know what that thing was. You buy this thing on Amazon, you put it on the end of like your electric screwdriver, your electric drill, and just go to town on the inside of your boxes, and it'll rough it up, and the bees will try to fill up the little cracks with propolis. So that's a consideration. 5, now we're getting into things where it's like, okay, do I really want to do this, right? You could allow the bees to keep some detritus on your bottom board. Again, like there are beneficial microbes that live in this detritus that are thought to be able to contribute to colony health. Them all off, and then we slide the thing back in the hive. But you may consider leaving some debris in there. 6, again, like I said, we're getting more and more controversial here. Allow some degree of wax moth cleanup. Again, wax moths play a role in nature in detoxifying the hive by processing old comb that contains high levels of environmental contaminants and pathogens. Also, the material from developing larvae like feces and like shells and things like that make the cells smaller. If you remember that the life cycle of a wax moth is about 6 to 7 weeks long, most of us have our wax moths or start to experience wax moth infestations like in the fall, right? And if we lived in a colder climate where it freezes, all the wax moths would be killed off in like December, January, February. And so in a maybe more typical climate, not a Mediterranean climate, the wax moths would come in, they'd do some damage, the winter would kill them, then a fresh swarm would come in, the swarm would clean out the leave behinds, the frass, and then you have sort of a refreshed colony ready for the swarm that's been cleaned up to some degree. Peter doesn't like any of this stuff.
So when you talk about the decision to treat or not treat wax moths, there's kind of an elephant in the room,
Mm-hmm.
which is you really can't distinguish between them and hive beetles. So, and I don't see any mention of not treating hive beetles
Yeah.
in your presentation.
I've never had like a real hive beetle problem. I've got like 1 or 2 hive beetles that I see, but I've never had like a full sliming, as they say, like from hive beetles. I've seen hives that have been slimed like in just old boxes that I leave around, sometimes, but this is a consideration. And I would never let my box, I would never, if I decided to do nothing about wax moths, I would change my opinion and I would change my practices when I started to see like this kind of stuff or that kind of stuff. I wouldn't let my frames get to that point, because then you got to scrape the whole thing and make the poor bee start over again. And if I have frames like this or I have frames like that, no, I'm cool with that. I think a lot of guys like Oliver would probably agree.
I've had serious wax moth problems
Yeah,
where it looks like the bottom two,
yeah.
but also like the top two. If I have frames like that in the top two, do I just scrape that area off? Or do I leave it and let the bees take care of it? Or
I think it depends on the time of the year, right? If it's the fall and you're just going to store these things in your garage, if you do nothing, those wax moths are just going to continue to multiply and just chew all that stuff up, and you're going to open the Tupperware bin and you're going to see this in like February, right? So you could simulate a winter by taking those frames and putting them in the freezer, killing off the wax moths.
but it still leaves those trails.
It leaves all those trails, but that's fine. The bees will clean that up. No problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Like I said, we're getting into controversial territory here. You have to decide where you are in the spectrum of craziness, right? Like, how crazy are you going to be? So 7 out of 8 is let your bees make drones if it's a healthy colony. If you have a healthy colony, you want that colony to spread those healthy genetics out into the world, right? Like what Conrad would probably, Conrad makes drones so that he can have his genetics be in his local area there to make good, strong queens. Most of us would see this and go, oh no, and scrape it right off because we think, oh no, that's where all the mite, that's going to be the mite farm down here. I would think about if you've got a healthy hive, that means you're going to have healthy drones that are carrying those good genes out into the gene pool, right? And so all the other queens in the area will mate with those guys and then propagate those good genetics. And it's only the strongest, healthiest colonies that have the energy to produce all these drones and waste good real estate on like drone comb. But again, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to keep a real close eye on your Varroa levels because Varroa are, there's some ratio like 1.3 times more Varroa mite infestations come from drone comb than regular brood comb. So you have to consider that. 8, minimize fiddling with things and reorganizing things. Remember, there's this guy that says how to checkerboard your bees. And then like the next YouTube video that popped up was, oh no, is my checkerboard colony doomed? If you have to ask that question, maybe the answer is yes. So, and then of course, Varroa. This is a slide from you all know who, right? Right, our friend. If you're gonna be a non-treater, you really need to be careful and watch your hives because you don't, in our small backyards and our small side yards, you don't want your hive to become a mite bomb and then spread all those mites out everywhere. So that's breeding for strong mites and weak bees. So this is what the literature says. If your mite levels are getting too high, euthanize the colony, as painful as that is. Or, now we're talking about being interventionist again, treat the colony for Varroa and requeen. Okay, so I know I've got like a couple minutes left. Yeah, so I was gonna kind of get into this concept of like, there are two different types of selection at play here. There's resistance, right? So can you have bees that are resistant to viruses? Or, and you know, they talk about this red queen effect. And the quote from Alice in Wonderland is, "Here we must run as fast as we can just to stay in place." And this sort of refers to like the evolutionary arms race, right? Like the bees can become resistant to some virus, but then the virus mutates and the bees are susceptible to it again. Then the bees become resistant to that virus or that strain, and then the whole cycle continues. So you're running, but you're not really going anywhere because you're just fighting against, you know, the evolution of something else that's your enemy or your, you know, your problem. So again, as soon as we develop virus-resistant bees, viruses will evolve to overcome the resistance that we've bred into the bees. And, you know, in reality, if Bryan Hains in my backyard, I've got some bees that are sort of mite resistant, and I've got good drones that are going out into the environment. You know, there are hundreds of colonies, managed and wild, feral, out in the Bay Area. I'm not really making a difference in the bee population in general, really. It's a problem of scaling. And so there's a literature that was sort of booming in 2019s about this Darwinian black box selection for resistance to parasites. And then a follow-up literature started to come around, well, I guess about at the same time, talking about tolerance versus resistance. So we're not getting rid of these viruses. My efforts in my backyard isn't gonna do anything to the levels of viruses and mites in you all's hives, probably, right? But we can help our bees develop a tolerance where they can live with these viruses and live with mites, but be less susceptible to the influence of viruses in a negative way. The caveat, of course, is you might have bees that are resistant to viruses, but the flourishing of these pathogens, but then other bees are now being exposed to like these higher levels of pathogens. And so here's, I think that I just have 2 slides left. This is a diagram from a paper explaining the difference between resistance and tolerance. And the key points here, we don't have time to go through all the panels here, but the key messages here are that in resistance, you're trying to limit the number of pathogens. So, you know, we could live with mites as long as mites didn't coexist with viruses. Whereas in tolerance, you're just trying to limit the damage caused by these pathogens, because in reality, you're never going to get rid of the pathogens. And so this tolerance idea sort of replaced the idea of resistance in terms of like favor, right? Like people are thinking like, we're never going to get tolerant bees. I mean, we're never going to resist. We're never going to get resistant bees, but we can develop tolerant bees. So the key here is like eliminating pathogens versus living with some amount of pathogens. And so Tom Seeley published this paper in 2007, where he had this patch of forest called the Arnott Forest in upstate New York. It's a 1,651 hectare research preserve that he started studying in 1978. And in 1978, he found about 1.0 colonies per square kilometer of forest. Then Varroa mites moved in 1994, and he's continued to study the same area of forest. And after 2002, it's the same density of colonies. So the bees have Varroa mites, but they've somehow become more tolerant to the presence of the mites and the presence of viruses associated with the mites. So he's using this as evidence to say that, yeah, like this tolerance resistance idea is feasible. It could happen in nature. Like these bees aren't being treated, they're not being manipulated, they're allowed to just do whatever they want to do, like on their own in the forest. And so this is the last slide. You know, we all want healthy and productive bees. If we're trying to generate thousands of gallons of honey or nukes to sell or just tons of bees to pollinate the almonds, everybody wants those bees to survive, right? Like the commercial guys want their bees to live. I want my bees to live. You guys want your bees to live. But we all have different goals, right? Like, and so in considering this approach of Darwinian beekeeping versus like doing what the commercial guys do, you kind of have to consider your own style and your own goals and like what you want for your bees in addition to like what you want for yourself. And so hopefully this summary kind of helps you maybe think about that more. So that's it. Thanks, everyone. If we have time, I'm sure people have opinions and things to say, and maybe we get some fights going. Who's ready to fight?
So when I started, it was 15 years ago, mice were terrible.
Mm-hmm.
My sidewalk was covered with bees with deformed wings that couldn't fly. And if you didn't treat, the hive just died.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like that today. I don't know how the bees are handling the mites, but I haven't done any treatments at all since last October. And
Yeah.
even then, it was only 2 out of the 7 hives.
Mm-hmm.
It's the condition. I don't think it's our philosophy that has changed. It's the condition that's changed. The bees have, I thought it was going to take 1 million years for them to
Mhm.
evolve to be like Japanese bees, but they've done it in 15 years.
And you don't buy packages or get
Absolutely
queens
not.
shipped in from anywhere.
I've
Yeah.
never bought a package, and I took my name off the swarm list because my own bees were swarming too much and
Mhm.
I had too many bees.
Just want to make a little comment. I started beekeeping last year and I bought a nuke through the guild
Yeah.
and that was in May. And by July, I think I noticed bees were on the ground with deformed wings and all that. And basically, I had brought somebody in who knew more than I did after 3 months of beekeeping. And they said, yeah, your hive is dying. You don't have a queen. And fortunately, I was able to get a swarm from the local area. And that
Mhm.
since then, that hive has just been great. So your comment earlier about bringing something in from outside
Yeah. Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
always work.
Yeah,
It
even
just
as far as
locale.
even as far as Grass Valley, Nevada City, Chico, like the coast, local scrappy bees.
Yeah.
I feel like there's something to them.
I'm gonna argue that our small hive beetle world is where Varroa is headed to, is tolerance.
Uh-huh.
All my hives have beetles in them.
Yeah.
And I see the beetles go by, and for the most part, the bees, they don't even notice
Yeah.
because the beetles
Yeah.
are good at that. And I always figure that's my trade, is when I inspect a hive, that my job is to crush all the beetles I see. But I actually think it doesn't make any difference. And I've never had a hive overrun by beetles. They're just there.
Yeah.
And I think that's to what Peter's point is I think maybe we're getting close to that on Varroa. They'll
Yeah.
just be there.
Yeah, I feel that same way. Like I'll see a couple hive beetles, but it's okay. I've never been slimed. I don't put those little traps in there. You know, at one point, like I fiddled around with all the traps, the DVD cases and the little black things you can buy online. Just let me catch some beetles, but yeah, yeah, they didn't work for me.
Now, do you allow the spiders to live on your under your top covers?
Do I? I don't know. I think they're annoying, so I probably just wipe them. You know,
I used to do that. Now I leave them.
Leave
I'm
'em.
like,
part of-
they don't eat many.
it's part of the super organism,
There you go.
right? They do something in there. The bees allow them to be in there for some reason.
You mentioned something about bees from one hive going into another hive.
Yeah.
Or like, he just said he caught a swarm and combined it with the hive that he had, if I understood you correctly. And bees seem to recognize their home
Hmm.
when you watch them coming. I mean, if I have 2 or 3 hives, now I only have one, but when I've had 3 or 4 hives, I could see bees going to individual
Yeah.
hives.
Yeah.
But do bees actually just go into another hive sometime and
I-
hang out there and see if they want to live there? And
I think there's a known phenomenon of drift. Like,
ah,
yeah, right,
thank you.
right. Yeah. So they'll drift. They'll move from the weak hive into the strong hive. I used to have, many years ago, I had like 2 hives with scales underneath them, connected to like little computers, and it would sample the weight of the hive every minute. And so I could see, it was fascinating. Every morning, like the hive would drop like 2 pounds, and then it would slowly come back to 2 pounds and then gain 1 more pound. So like the foragers would leave, and all day long, like the weight would accumulate from like the nectar that they brought home. Then the foragers would come home, and it would be net like plus 1 or 3 pounds every day. It would change depending on the season. And of course, like when they swarmed, I could see like a very rapid drop of, 3 pounds or 4 pounds. And I actually had the computer like detect that and send me an email. Oh yeah, I gotta go home, Maybe I can catch that swarm before it like goes and get the swarms, because oftentimes you'll go home and you won't even know that your hives have swarmed because they're still busy and stuff, right? But I do these missions and get my swarms and stuff. So that was a lot of fun, right? And you could see, like one hive would gain like 4 pounds one day and the other hive would lose 4 pounds one day. And so I was like, oh, this one hive must have been robbing that other hive. Or, probably you could detect drift if you could somehow parcel that out. Like these bees are coming, instead of coming home to this hive, going into this hive. I don't know. There's a lot of cool stuff I saw doing that.
Any questions on Zoom? You're welcome to come off mute if you'd like. Well, maybe that's all. Thank you very much.
That's
Very
great.
interesting.
Thanks, everyone.